This video was possible with the help of the Wolf of YouTube. Enjoy!
Why is the Battle of Alamein in Egypt the most celebrated British Commonwealth victory of the Second World War? Why did the Allies fight so much of the war around the Mediterranean, thousands of miles from the real target, Nazi Germany? The American army was sure from the start that the quickest way to beat Hitler was across the English Channel, 21 miles wide, into German-occupied France and on to Berlin. But in 1942, President Roosevelt and the Americans were still newcomers to the war. Winston Churchill would persuade them to target not France, but supposedly easier territory in North Africa and later Italy, what he called the soft underbelly of Hitler's Europe. In reality, the soft underbelly would see some of the worst carnage in Western Europe. Fighting akin to the Great War of 1914-18. Britain and America became bogged down, while the Soviet war machine ground on remorselessly towards the real target, Berlin. This film is about how the war in the Mediterranean turned sour, poisoning relations between the Allies and bringing Churchill to one of his lowest moments of the war. The fascinating question, I think, is why did Churchill and the British persist in their Mediterranean strategy? During the Great War, Winston Churchill had revolted against the stalemate in the trenches of the Western Front by proposing a campaign in the Mediterranean to knock out Germany's junior ally, the Ottoman Turks. The half-baked landings at Gallipoli almost destroyed his political career. But Churchill never lost his conviction that the Mediterranean was the theatre where a decisive breakthrough could be made. Now, in 1942, he hoped once again to win the war by striking through the Mediterranean. But could he persuade his allies, Russia and America? In August, Churchill became the first Allied leader to fly to Moscow to meet Stalin face to face. In the Kremlin, he condensed his strategy into a simple image. Sketching the outline of a crocodile, he told Stalin that France was Hitler's hard snout, but the Mediterranean was the soft underbelly of the Axis. That was where the Allies should make their first stab. The soft underbelly was a brilliantly seductive idea. Churchill presented it as common sense, sound strategy. But in reality, it masked his fears about the weakness of the British Army. And it also suited Britain's interests very well, because it would eliminate the British Empire's rivals in the Mediterranean. But would the Americans buy it? The US Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, was not taken in by the soft underbelly. But he wouldn't make the final decision. President Roosevelt was determined to mount some kind of offensive against Germany in 1942, above all to head off political opponents who wanted to focus on the war against Japan in the Pacific. For FDR, the opinion polls were alarming, indicating that 20% of Americans were inclined to sign a peace with Hitler so they could concentrate on getting revenge on the Japanese for Pearl Harbor. To put it bluntly, Roosevelt needed American blood to be shed by the Germans so his people would feel committed to the European war. And as a politician, he really wanted the action to start before the midterm elections of November 1942. So the president simply overruled Marshall. Roosevelt gave the go-ahead for Operation Torch, an invasion of Morocco and Algeria by American and British troops to attack Rommel as he retreated from Alamein, where Montgomery's British Commonwealth forces had won a smashing victory. For his own political reasons, Roosevelt had bought into Churchill's grand idea. In 1942, the soft underbelly became the Allies' compromise strategy. For better and for worse, there would be real military benefits, but also lasting consequences for the post-war world. To keep the American military sweet, Churchill let Roosevelt and Marshall propose a commander of the combined American and British forces for the Torch landings. The choice was between two up-and-coming generals, Dwight Eisenhower and Mark Clark. Clark was shrewd and meticulous, but also relentlessly ambitious and deeply insecure. "The higher you climb the flagpole," he once said, "the more of your ass is exposed." He was also congenitally suspicious of the Brits. Ike was junior to Clark, and as Brooke caustically remarked, he had never even commanded a battalion in action. But he had priceless assets for the role of commanding an alliance of nations. A ready smile, a gregarious manner, and above all, total commitment to making the Anglo-American alliance really work. Eisenhower dealt ruthlessly with all who took a narrowly nationalistic view. One American officer was sent home for insulting a British officer. The Brit tried to intercede. "Sir, he only called me an SOB." Ike was unmoved. "I understand he called you a British SOB. That is quite different. My ruling stands." It was Ike who got command of Torch, and he would never look back. The Torch landings were the greatest amphibious assault in history to date, dwarfing Gallipoli in 1915. And they went far better than that disaster, which had blackened Churchill's name in the Great War. For now, Churchill's soft underbelly strategy appeared to be working. The Americans were on side, the Germans seemed to be on the run. Hopes were high that by Christmas 1942, the Allies would reach Tunis and squeeze Rommel out of North Africa. These hopes were not mere illusion. Drawing on daily ultra-decrypts from Britain's top-secret code-breaking centre at Bletchley Park, Churchill believed that the Germans were about to cut their losses in North Africa and pull out. The question was, could Ultra always be taken at face value? The codebreakers, for all their brilliance, were limited by the military messages on which they worked. Bletchley Park could shed little light into the manic mind of Adolf Hitler. Determined not to be humiliated, in November 1942, the Führer performed a dramatic U-turn. And decided to make a stand in Tunisia, rushing in fresh troops and supplies. Hitler's last-ditch reinforcements enabled the Germans to hang on in Tunisia until the rains came and the sandy tracks turned to mud. The months of desert war that followed at least gave American soldiers valuable battle experience. Roosevelt and Marshall had been faced with the task of creating an army even more quickly than Churchill and Brooke.
Boy, do I remember breaking in them first GI shoes. We learned quick it was a fighting outfit from that rugged training we got here and overseas.
Troops had to be trained and supplied, and equally important, taught how to fight with allies. Many GIs got a bad name among the British for their high pay and brash confidence. There were punch-ups in British pubs after GIs used lines like, "Give me a beer as quick as you guys got out of Dunkirk." The real war therefore came as a rude shock. In February 1943, American forces at the Kasserine Pass in the Tunisian mountains were routed by Rommel in a surprise attack. The Green GIs, badly led, were forced back 85 miles in 7 days, one of the worst American defeats of the war. Eisenhower reported to Marshall, "Our people, from the very highest to the lowest, have learned that this is not a child's game." The story was played down in America, but there was considerable malicious satisfaction in Britain. The great war song, "The Yanks Are Coming," was heard again with new words. The Yanks are running.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere, so prepare.
4,000 Allied prisoners were taken at Kasserine. And to add to America's humiliation, some of the GIs were shipped to Italy and marched as a spectacle through Rome.
And we won't come back till it's over there.
With the North African campaign dragging on, British and American leaders met in Casablanca to discuss what they could salvage from this setback. Churchill and Brooke were quite clear: finish the job in North Africa and then continue to stab at the soft underbelly by targeting Hitler's weaker partner, Italy. Marshall could see the way things were going. He grumbled that the Mediterranean was turning into a suction pump. But bogged down in Tunisia, the Americans were in a weak position to argue, and British military planners ran rings around them. One US general commented, "We came, we saw, and we were conquered." After months of muddy stalemate, the Allies regrouped, and in May 1943, they finally captured Tunis. The haul was immense, some 250,000 prisoners, including a dozen German generals. North Africa had finally been cleared of enemy troops, and the Mediterranean was now open to Allied shipping. But although the Americans talked up the victory as Tunisgrad, it came 6 months too late. That half year since Alamein and Stalingrad was of decisive importance. The Red Army was now surging west, while total victory in North Africa came too late to change Anglo-American strategy for 1943. Marshall was still pushing for the cross-channel invasion to be given priority. But was he right? It's clear from the Dieppe disaster that the Allies could not have established a firm foothold in France in 1942. They might have in 1943, but only if they'd done nothing in North Africa in order to build up troops and resources here in Britain. But even then, it would have been very iffy, because the Allies had not yet gained clear supremacy in the air against the Luftwaffe, or control of the Atlantic supply lines against the U-boats. What's certain is that the failure to clear North Africa, as hoped, by the end of 1942, made it virtually impossible to cross the Channel in strength in 1943. So Churchill and Brooke's Mediterranean strategy continued to triumph by default. With no option of attacking France, the Americans were persuaded to beach hop from Africa to Sicily in July 1943.
We have a good plan. There can only be one end to this next battle, and that is another success. Forward to victory. Let us knock Italy out of the war.
This was more Monty bravado. The Sicily landings were a mess, and 3 German divisions gave 2 far superior Allied armies a hard, month-long battle, inflicting 20,000 casualties. More disturbing still, cooperation between the British and American commanders was breaking down. Monty and the British, still sceptical about the quality of the GIs after Kasserine, tried to sideline the US forces. But while Monty's 8th Army worked its way slowly through Sicily in brutal battles, an American rival surged across the island in a series of dashing tank offensives. "Goddamn all the British," fumed General George Patton. "I'd rather be commanded by an Arab." Patton treated the campaign in Sicily as what he called a horse race with Monty, insisting that the US must win not as an ally, but as a conqueror. Despite the Allies bickering, Churchill's strategy still appeared to be paying off. With Sicily invaded, Mussolini was toppled in a political coup. The Italians surrendered and tried to side with the Allies. But the Germans now moved in to occupy Italy. Churchill was convinced it was vital to get into Italy before Hitler consolidated his hold. This was a decisive moment. Up till now, Churchill's soft underbelly strategy had paid off. The Mediterranean, the artery of empire, was secure, and British armies had learned how to fight without getting into a bloodbath like the Somme. But now, a bright idea would become a dark obsession. Increasingly for Churchill, the Mediterranean would become not a means to an end, but the end in itself. He expected Italian-controlled islands in the Aegean to fall quickly into British hands. With such rich pickings on offer, Churchill was ready to put Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, on hold. This is clear from a top-secret meeting in October 1943, which reveals just how far Churchill was willing to go in deceiving his American allies. Churchill told the British Chiefs of Staff his priorities would now be 1. To reinforce the Italian theatre to the full. 2. To enter the Balkans. 3. To hold our position in the Aegean Islands. 4. To build up our air forces and intensify our air attacks on Germany. 5. To encourage the steady assembly in this country of United States troops with a view to taking advantage of the softening in the enemy's resistance due to our operations in other theatres, though this might not occur until after the spring of 1944. Plodding, bureaucratic words, you might think, but actually diplomatic dynamite. Churchill was saying that the British, given a free hand, would put crossing the Channel at the bottom of their list of priorities. His sweet talk about Overlord was simply to jolly along the Americans. And there's that telling phrase about building up US troops in Britain to take advantage of a softening in enemy resistance elsewhere. Here again, Churchill was following British imperial tradition. The Empire had always preferred to wage a war of attrition rather than fight direct. It had taken 20 years to beat Napoleon, and for much of that time the British army had been deployed in Spain, while the Russians slogged it out with the French. Churchill shunned going head-to-head with a full-strength German army. Better to wear the enemy down by squeezing the Mediterranean and ratcheting up the bombing until Hitler's Reich began to crack. Crossing the Channel would simply be finishing the job. Churchill's obsession with penetrating the soft underbelly was not completely madcap. He found support for his strategy in intelligence reports from Bletchley that suggested that the Germans were ready to throw in the towel in Italy. Ultra indicated that once the Allies got established on the toe of Italy, the Germans would pull back north towards the Alps. That would give the Allies some excellent Italian airfields from which to bomb the industrial cities of southern Germany. But once again, Ultra couldn't get into the crevices of Hitler's brain. In October 1943, faced with the humiliation of losing Rome, the Führer performed another about-turn and instructed his generals to fight for the imperial city. And so Italy, like Tunisia, became a protracted, grinding struggle. This time, the mountainous terrain was ideal for the German defenders. Italy's Apennine Range is over 800 miles long, some 80 miles wide, and it rises to 4,000 feet. So the soft underbelly turned out to have a rocky spine. After the war, one German general offered a friendly piece of advice. Next time you're invading Italy, don't start at the bottom. The British and Americans battled their way north, but autumn rains and winter snow then made movement almost impossible for months on end. Churchill had predicted that Italy would be a springboard for the Allies. Instead, as he grimly admitted, it turned out to be a sofa on which they got well and truly stuck. The Americans were blunter. General Mark Clark said that the soft underbelly turned out to be a tough old gut. Churchill blustered that the Allies were diverting German troops from France. In fact, it was the other way round. The Germans were diverting the Allies from the real Second Front. With bloody fighting at Salerno, Ortona, and the Rapido River, Italy was turning into a costly sideshow. The situation was even worse in the Aegean, which Churchill had expected to mop up. In fact, the Germans moved in first. On the island of Leros, a small but determined German unit overcame a larger British force without much of a fight. It seemed like Tobruk all over again. Churchill kept clamouring for American help to hit back and invade Rhodes, the German stronghold in the Aegean. But now even Brooke snapped. He considered Churchill's plan sheer madness. The Americans are already desperately suspicious of him, and this will make matters far worse. Brooke wanted all the Allied resources devoted to Italy, rather than being dissipated around the Mediterranean. The Prime Minister was isolated from even his closest military advisor. As for Marshall, he had no interest in Italy, and he was enraged by Churchill's bombast about Rhodes, telling the PM to his face, "Not one American soldier is going to die on that goddamn beach." Marshall and Roosevelt were determined to push through Operation Overlord, the invasion of France through Normandy, in the spring of 1944. They were now thoroughly fed up with Churchill's obsession about the Mediterranean. Overlord wasn't merely a strategy. It had become a metaphor for who was on top in the special relationship. Armed with evidence of Churchill's intrigues against the plans for invading France, Marshall sent a blistering memo to Roosevelt, insisting that further indecision, evasion, and the undermining of agreements cannot be borne. The Prime Minister must be told that he must now give his unqualified support to Overlord, or else propose an acceptable alternate course of action to guarantee victory over Germany. At the end of November 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met once again at Tehran. But now they were joined for the first time by Stalin, whose armies were rolling the Germans back and had recently liberated the whole of the Ukraine. Stalin was in a strong position, and he knew it. The Soviet leader had tolerated the Mediterranean strategy in 1942. But he was furious that Churchill had kept it going during 1943. He shared the American desire to pin Churchill down on launching a second front in France in the spring of 1944. In the opening session, Roosevelt made clear his view that the cross-channel attack should not be delayed by any secondary operation. Stalin was even blunter. He said that Hitler was trying to keep as many Allied divisions as possible in Italy, where no decision could be reached. Better to strike at the heart of Germany through an invasion of northern France. It was 2-1 for Overlord. Churchill was outvoted. The press and newsreels captured pictures of the big three smiling and chatting as equals. But privately, Churchill muttered that the little British donkey was caught between the Russian bear and the American elephant. It was an apt image. The two big beasts favoured a direct attack into Germany because they had the strength to do so. Stalin had masses of men and didn't care how many he lost. Roosevelt, as a leader of a democracy, had to be more careful. But the Americans could bring to bear massive firepower. Unlike Churchill, neither of them intended to wait until the Third Reich had been softened up. Next day, the shift of power got personal. Stalin kept needling Churchill about whether the British was serious about overlord, and Roosevelt took his side in the hope of showing the Russians that they weren't facing an Anglo-American bloc. At dinner, Stalin remarked that to stop a third European war, at least 50,000 and perhaps 100,000 of the German High Command should be physically liquidated. Churchill lost his cool. The British Parliament and people will not tolerate mass executions. FDR offered what he dryly called a compromise. How about shooting only 49,000? At this point, Churchill stomped out of the room in disgust. "You are pro-German," Stalin taunted. Churchill, tired out, had overreacted to the gallows humour. But at a deeper level, I think he was venting his frustration at Britain becoming the junior partner in the alliance, now that the vast power of America and Russia had been fully mobilised. The exertions of Tehran and the frustrations of Italy, challenges to his basic worldview, brought Churchill to one of his lowest points of the war. In mid-December, stopping off in Tunis en route back to Britain, he contracted pneumonia and suffered 2 minor heart attacks. For a day or two, there were fears for his life, and his wife flew out to be with him. Churchill had driven himself too far. But his collapse was not merely physical. This was a leader who could begin to see the limits of his power and that of the empire he'd vowed to preserve. Yet Churchill remained a fighter. As he recovered, his energy was still directed towards completing the campaign in Italy and justifying his Mediterranean gamble. In January 1944, Churchill persuaded the Americans to retain landing craft earmarked for Normandy in the Mediterranean so he could mount a landing behind enemy lines at Anzio, only 40 miles from Rome. This was a last bold throw of the dice to win a quick victory in Italy. The landings were a complete success. But the troops failed to move swiftly off the beachhead and were then hemmed in by German counterattacks.
Hello, BBC. Winfred Vaughan Thomas speaking with Herbert Walden recording. That's the sounds of the first sound of our own attack. First bomb's going down. It's away to the left of us, but even back here, the ground around is shaking viciously, and Walden's recording truck is now rocking on its springs.
The attack became bogged down as soldiers dug into ditches and gullies that in places ran only 50 yards from the enemy lines. Churchill blamed the sluggish American commander, General John Lucas, for not racing towards Rome. The Americans claimed that Churchill's plan was flawed from the start. Lucas wrote in his diary, "The whole affair has a strong odour of Gallipoli, and apparently the same amateur is still on the coach's bench." With no decisive breakthrough, the slugging match in Italy dragged on. One of the most epic and tragic battles took place at the German-held monastery of Monte Cassino, which towered some 1,700 feet above the valley below. Besieging this spectacular natural fortress was the absurd culmination of the soft underbelly strategy. A succession of British units, many of them actually Poles, Canadians, Indians, New Zealanders, took terrible casualties in courageous assaults on German positions. The monastery itself was flattened by Allied bombers. Later, the Allies bombed the town below. But the rubble proved even better for its defenders. The struggle for Cassino dragged on for 5 months in rain and sleet, snow and mud. Surveying the blasted landscape, the German commander was reminded of the Great War, when he said, "I experienced the same loneliness crossing the battlefield of the Somme." Ironically, Churchill had created in Italy what he wanted to avoid in France.
Fighting had been severe in the extreme. Men fought till they dropped exhausted, or dropped killed or wounded. They had to get through appalling mountain tracks, with the Germans commanding them and pouring streams of fire upon them at every move. You could by day remain alive only in a hole in the ground. To show yourself and move in daylight in these forward positions was death.
Eventually, a coordinated attack by Allied units did force the Germans to withdraw. The Poles, the most recklessly brave of Allied soldiers, had the honour of taking the remains of the monastery, for which over 1,000 of their comrades had died. In late May 1944, American troops, now heavily reinforced, finally broke out of the Anzio beachhead. The Americans were ordered to drive east in order to cut off the Germans, at last in retreat from Cassino. But the commander of the breakout was Mark Clark. Fuming at playing second fiddle to Eisenhower and at being relegated to a theatre of operations dominated by the Brits, Clark unilaterally diverted troops of his US Fifth Army northwest to take Rome. He wrote later, "We not only wanted the honour of capturing Rome, but we felt that we more than deserved it. We intended to see that the people back home knew that it was the Fifth Army that did the job, and knew the price that had been paid for it." Most of the Germans retreating from Cassino escaped to the north, but Clark had won his prize. Early on the 5th of June, he held a carefully staged conference with his senior staff on the Capitoline Hill, surrounded by press and cameramen. "Well, gentlemen," Clark declared with studied nonchalance, I really didn't expect to have a press conference here. I just called a meeting with my commanders to discuss the situation. However, I'll be glad to answer your questions. This is a great day for the Fifth Army. No mention here of the troops of the British Empire or France who'd helped make possible Clark's Roman triumph. Even patriotic American pressmen were embarrassed. One commented, "On this historic day, I feel like vomiting." The soft underbelly had been Churchill's grand idea. But the Americans had stolen the glory by taking the imperial city. But having tried to deceive his American allies on strategy, Churchill was in no position to complain when they gave him the runaround on tactics. In any case, Mark Clark's moment in the spotlight was short-lived. Next day, the long-awaited Second Front, led by his rival Dwight Eisenhower, opened for real in Normandy. To his aides, the weary Prime Minister was still complaining that Overlord had been forced upon us by the Russians and the United States military authorities. Yet in public, Churchill put the best face on things and threw himself into preparations for D-Day. But in private, fear about attacking the hard snout of the Axis still gnawed at Churchill's belly. In October 1943, he foresaw Overlord turning into a disaster greater than Dunkirk. And on the night before D-Day, Churchill dined alone, pensively with his wife. Just before going to bed, he turned to her. "Do you realise that by the time you wake up tomorrow morning, 20,000 men may have been killed?"
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is a special bulletin read by John Snag. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress.
Churchill's gloom was misplaced. Total Allied casualties on D-Day, killed, wounded and missing, were 10,000, not 20,000. The generals had learnt their trade in the backwaters of the Mediterranean. In the euphoria about the landings, the news from Rome was wiped off the front pages. Churchill's soft underbelly had become a mere appendix. The real drama was now being played out on beaches closer to home. Churchill, the bulldog, kept fighting Britain's corner, but the Americans were now determined to dictate strategy in the West. In the battle across France and Germany, they were the dominant partners. Monty, hero of Britain's desert victory, was now firmly under Eisenhower. As Churchill sensed at Tehran, the Big Three was becoming a thing of the past. In a future increasingly defined by America and Russia, British diplomats started talking sardonically about the big 2.5. Britain would soon be stripped of its imperial assets. By 1945, the British position in India had become untenable, and within 2 years, a Labour government, in which Stafford Cripps was a leading member, would concede full Indian independence. Mussolini, the last Roman emperor, ended his days strung upside down by Italian partisans in a petrol station in Milan. But he wasn't the only imperial visionary whose dreams were shattered by the war. In 1940, Churchill had been the voice of freedom echoing around the world. But the war for freedom hastened the end of empire. The decline and fall of Mussolini's Roman Empire came quickly. The British Empire had deeper foundations, but these too were undermined by the Second World War. The Mediterranean strategy of gradually squeezing Germany rather than going for the jugular was an expression of weakness, not strength. Eventual victory over the Axis depended on strong allies like America and Russia with their own distinctive visions of the future. In the entrails of the soft underbelly, we can discern the death pangs of the British Empire.